China has a tendency to increase their rhetoric so that it looks like they're in a legitimate position when they become more aggressive. So I see this less as a warning to Washington and more a standard operating procedure in China to set the stage for propaganda and for rhetoric that if they do decide to use force in the region, they can blame it on the United States and say that their actions were justified.
This time in the programme, we like to take a look at the top stories internationally, and one making Wednesday's front pages now to China, where the US and China are said to be heading towards inevitable conflict if Washington doesn't change its approach. Well, that's the warning, at least from Beijing, speaking during a press conference in which he defended his country's strengthening relationships with Russia. China's new foreign minister, Qin Gang, says China-US relations have seriously deviated. To reflect on this, I'm joined by the former senior China strategist for the US Air Force, Dr. Oriana Skylar Mastro, who's now Professor of Political Science at Stanford University. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you for having me.
How seriously should Washington take these warnings?
Well, I think the most serious part of them is that China has a tendency to increase their rhetoric so that it looks like they're in a legitimate position when they become more aggressive. So I see this less as a warning to Washington and more a standard operating procedure in China to set the stage for propaganda and for rhetoric that if they do decide to use force in the region, they can blame it on the United States and say that their actions were justified.
Speaking in this press conference, the country's new foreign minister said ties between Beijing and Moscow set an example for global foreign relations. What do you take from that?
Well, I think one of the narratives, at least in Washington, if not in many capitals around the world, is that surely Xi Jinping and China in particular have learned their lesson, right? They've been aggressive and they've been assertive across the board in a lot of policies, and that we should expect some sort of moderation, whether it be a moderation domestically with the loosening of economic controls post-COVID, or some sort of moderation or the lessening of the wolf warrior diplomacy. I think these types of statements show us that, if anything, China is going to be doubling down. While we think it's not smart for them to be so close to Moscow, they obviously feel differently. And so we can expect that relationship to continue to deepen in the future.
And yet Beijing very much positioning itself as a peacemaker, isn't it, in the Ukraine war?
Well, this is something that China does often to gain leverage and power. They position themselves as a mediator. The United States and U.S. allies sometimes don't have great relationships with certain countries or bad actors in the international system, whether that be North Korea, Iran, or in this case, Russia. China continues to have relationships with these countries. And so when the time comes to try to get them to the negotiating table, China is in a unique position. But we have to be clear, China doesn't do this for free. They're not doing us any favors. They have promoted now the idea of mediation and that they could play a role as a mediator. But like in previous instances with North Korea and Iran, that's going to come with a price tag. And they're going to ask the United States and potentially European countries for some things that they want in exchange for brokering peace in Ukraine.
Today's press conference being described as fiery by the Guardian, reporting on the front page of tomorrow's paper with China tells US to hit brakes or risk conflict. Was there anything to come from this press conference which perhaps came as a surprise to you?
I don't think there's anything that comes as a surprise. I think the most surprising thing to me is how surprised everyone is, if that makes sense. I mean, the Chinese have been very clear, not only in their rhetoric, in their discourse, in their domestic propaganda, in their activities in the region and the world, their focus on building specific military capabilities, decide to fight the United States, and now with these high altitude surveillance balloons, to help them in any of these types of contingencies. The fact of the matter is the Chinese have been preparing for a very long time to potentially fight a war with the United States and its allies. Now we're seeing potentially some of the rhetoric to back that up, but that has been a primary priority and concern for China for decades.
In today's press conference, Qin Gang blamed the US for these worsening relations, specifically mentioning the balloon incident, the spy balloon as it's been called, plus Taiwan and the Ukraine war and tensions there. Is there a point to be made, actually, about some of the simmering tensions coming from the US side too?
To a certain degree, there is, but only because what the Chinese have in mind, whether it's their idea of a new type of major power relationship or having better relations with the United States, their bottom line is that the United States and China can have positive relations as long as the United States does whatever China wants. This is a standard position that they have with a lot of countries in the world. And for a long time, the United States was trying a different approach of engagement. And I can see how it's confusing to China that from their perspective, their position on Taiwan has not changed. Their position on, exploitation of foreign technology for their own benefit has not changed. It is U.S. policy that's changing. But from the U.S. perspective, the United States tried as long as possible to maintain constructive and positive relations with China in hopes that some of those activities and policies would change. And so it is true that now the United States is coming to a point where it has to engage in a more competitive way with China. But I wouldn't necessarily, therefore, put the blame on the United States for the increased tensions. I would say it's quite surprising that the United States didn't shift to this type of policy much earlier on.
Can we just reflect on one of the other interesting points leading to much commentary following this press conference from China's foreign minister, who is quoted as saying Western countries led by the United States have implemented all-round containment, encirclement and suppression of China, which has brought unprecedented severe challenges to our country's development. What do you make of that?
Well, I think there's one aspect of scapegoating there, right? There's definitely some economic challenges that China currently faces, and it's always useful to say that those challenges are not because of any sort of mismanagement of the economy and the part of the Communist Party, but due to external factors. As a side note, this is exactly the type of thing that they're going to tell the Chinese people in the situation in which there's conflict and they have to pay severe economic costs associated with that. The Chinese people are unlikely to blame the party or the government for that. They're probably more likely to point their finger at the United States. But the other aspect of that is somewhat of a preparation of the battle space to say that if a war happens, it's not China's fault. They have done this in every previous conflict that they have fought in which initially they say and rhetorically, listen, if we end up using force, it won't be our fault. It was because we were pushed into a corner. So I wouldn't take it too seriously in that. I don't think it means that if the United States changed its policy, all of a sudden China would no longer feel like it had to, quote unquote, reunify with Taiwan. But it does suggest that China is trying to make preparations to put themselves in a stronger position in case conflict does erupt.
It is very interesting, isn't it, to reflect on the kind of geopolitical aspect of this, particularly China's relationship in the global south. In today's press conference, we heard the foreign minister reference China as a force for global stability and prosperity, and it talked about busting the myth that modernization is westernization. It's an interesting thing to consider, isn't it? The relationship China has elsewhere around the world.
Oh, absolutely. Xi Jinping and even previous leaders in China have tried to position China as leader of the developing world, of the global south. And if you look at some basic statistics, like where the Chinese leaders engage in high-level visits and where U.S. leaders or European leaders do so, it's obvious that it's not so much that China is out-competing the United States in these areas, but that the United States is not really competing seriously. In a recent data set that I put together on high-level visits, it's really surprising how most U.S. presidents spend most of their time visiting European countries, in particular, Great Britain and Germany, while Xi Jinping and previous leaders have visited the majority of countries in Africa. I mean, we've never had a U.S. president even visit Central Asia before. Maybe we've only gone a handful of times to South Asia. So, and Chinese leaders have visited the top 75% of the poorest countries in the world, of which no U.S. president has really visited. So it's not surprising to me that they see this as an opening or a gap of where their power and influence could increase, and that competition is relatively weak in those areas.
I mean, on that point, the quote that stuck for me is the narrative about hogging the microphone, as he put it. That he said China could offer solutions to global challenges, but others were hogging the microphone. That does speak to an idea of the Western world, as you allude to, kind of not having the best of relations elsewhere around the world, particularly with the global south.
Well, and it's also this view, China has been, people like to say that they're competing and they're trying to make countries more autocratic. It's actually much more nuanced than that. Their position is really regime neutrality. What they're offering other countries is basically saying, listen, we understand that every country is unique and has their own pathway to development. If you want viewpoints and insights from China, we're happy to offer them, but we're not going to put our economic relationship in particular contingent on you following some sort of path. And that is quite popular in the developing world. And it also highlights the Chinese frustration, which is the sense that the United States doesn't adequately recognize all that they have accomplished in the past 30 years. Here's a country that in the 1990s had an economy smaller than that of France's. And then now they have the second largest economy in the world, in which some argue might even surpass that of the United States. And so I think there is a frustration in Beijing of what they view as sort of the constant lecturing on the part of the United States and their position of what are you lecturing me about? What have you achieved in the past 30 years? And so I think that comes out in some of these messages as well.
What is it that Beijing actually wants? I mean, the idea of hitting the brake, what would that mean? What would that look like?
So ultimately, I think what Beijing wants is the ability to do whatever they want to do without anyone having anything to say about it. When we talk about deterrence, like deterring China from using force, that is impacting Chinese decision-making. And while we think that's a good thing, the Chinese themselves don't like this idea that what they do or what they don't do is somewhat colored by their assessments of what the U.S. responses would be. And so in a lot of these areas, in particular in areas that they say are domestic in orientation, like Taiwan, they just want the United States to stay out of it because they think if the United States stayed out of it, then they can more easily manage some of these critical issues in the region. Also, whether it be North Korea or what have you, they believe that sort of the U.S. role exacerbates a lot of the security problems. So I think what they want, whether it's from the United States or U.S. allies and partners, is for these countries to do nothing and let China pursue their interests the way that they find it's best to pursue them.
Which clearly is not going to happen, which then leads to the question, how do you go about stabilizing U.S.-China relations?
The bottom line is we have conflicting interests. I always like to point out that, yes, if you do whatever China wants, then you don't have tensions with them. That is a truism, right? Or China wants to achieve all its goals without fighting a war. That is also true. But those aren't really insightful viewpoints because in the world in which we live in, right now, the United States and China both find it necessary to protect their security and their political, economic, and military interests. And unfortunately, we have diverse viewpoints on what those things are. And that makes it really hard to come to some sort of compromise. All that can really happen is some sort of modus vivendi in which the two countries decide that, not having everything they want is better than fighting for everything that they want. But unfortunately, it seems like while the United States is willing to accept that type of viewpoint, that China is moving away from that type of mentality.
And therefore, U.S.-China relations just beyond repair now?
Well, I think it depends on what your standards are, how close you want these two countries to get. I think we can maintain and manage tensions without the disruption of high-level conflict. I think we can manage tensions without any sort of hostility between the peoples of two countries. I have to say, before COVID at least, and hopefully sometime soon, would spend a lot of time in China, and while I would have discussions with my colleagues about these geopolitical issues, there was no personal hostility between our two sides. The ideological competition has not permeated down to the individual level. And so I think we can continue to have engagement, interaction, especially at the lower levels, and manage the tensions at the highest levels. But I think any sort of return to a time where the relationship was good, I would argue largely because China had no other choice because they were so much less powerful than the United States, And so they felt compelled in many cases to do what the United States wanted, even if that wasn't primarily in their interest. It's unlikely that we're going to return to that type of a situation in the future.
What fascinating insight. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us. The former senior China strategist for the US Air Force turned professor of political science at Stanford University, Dr. Oriana Skylar Mastro.